Hey, thanks for joining me today. So let's jump in. The topic we're discussing is what is 360 feedback. For today, we're just going to cover the broad strokes of what 360 actually is. I'm John Azera, and I'm founder of Fastmirror.com. I'm a behavioral scientist by training. I hold a master's degree in organizational psychology with an emphasis in industrial, organizational, and applied psychology. So what is 360 feedback? When we talk about 360 feedback, you might hear multiple terms used to describe the same thing. So for example, you might hear the term 360 or 360 degree feedback, multi-source feedback or MSF, multi-rater feedback or MRF, or crowdsourced feedback. Some variation of these terms is what you may hear. For purposes of this video, I'm going to use the terms 360 or 360 feedback. So what is 360 and how does it work? The 360 is a process in which an individual employee, also may be referred to as a subject or a target, receives feedback from coworkers and people they interact with on a regular basis. And the coworkers involved in the process may also be called raters. So subjects are the individuals receiving feedback, while raters are the individuals providing feedback on the subject. The typical raters involved in a 360 are a subject's manager, peers, direct reports, if any, and customers. And you may also have another category that we call others, and this is really just sort of a catch-all category that we use for individuals that can provide good feedback but maybe don't fall into any of these regular 4 buckets here. And the number of raters usually participating or providing feedback on a subject is about 8 to 10, but it can also be a lot more. So the term 360 and why we call it 360 really has a lot to do with this sort of visual representation. So if you imagine this circle, the red circle here, the individual, the subject or the target in the center, the 360 term really comes from all of these different groups or relationships that are surrounding the person. They're all providing feedback from multiple points of view. If you imagine somebody sitting in the middle of a circle surrounded by people that are providing feedback, that really kind of gives you a visual concept of what's going on with 360. So what does 360 actually do? 360 is largely used to assess subjective aspects like behavior or things that can be observed but are not easily quantifiable. It's not used to assess more objective measures like sales numbers or attendance or things like that. Some typical things that you might measure with 360 are things like leadership ability, soft skills, things like that, general behavior. You're really not going to be measuring sales numbers, attendance, production, things like that, things that you can capture more efficiently in other ways. So how does 360 work? How do you collect all that feedback from raters so you can really understand what they're saying about a particular subject? Well, the most common way is what we call the 360 survey. And the origin of the survey really comes from 2 places. You either buy one off the shelf from a vendor that sells 360 surveys, or you build and run your own in-house. At Fastmirror, we're really big fans and we're advocates of building your own survey in-house. The reason being is that you can customize it to your specific needs. You can measure your competencies, your values, and things that are important to you as an organization, which is things that you typically may not get if you buy something off the shelf. But either way, both are viable ways to go. So what you're looking at here on screen is an example of a 360 survey. This is actually our Fastmirror platform. This is an example of a 360 survey. This is an executive level 360. And you can see that the way that it works is you have a short statement and then you have a rating scale, or what we call a Likert scale. And you can see it right here. It runs from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and then you have maybe a don't know option. And then of course each of these labels has a score behind it. So strongly disagree is 1, disagree is 2, neutral is 3, agree is 4, strongly agree is 5. That could be a particular scoring option that you might utilize. Lower scores are going to mean lower agreement versus higher scores that'll mean stronger agreement. We design the surveys with a short series of questions, and these short series of questions are usually organized around larger soft skill concepts, or what might be referred to as competencies. In this case, we're looking at coaching and developing. If we continue on in this particular survey, we'll see some other ones. So there's about 3 or 4 items that compose coaching and developing. Now we start to get into decision making. So how does this 360 survey work to gather the feedback from all of the raters that we talked about earlier and provide it in a way that can be presented back to a subject? So if we go back to this earlier slide and we talked about these different groups here, the way that that survey actually works is that you're going to have multiple people in each of these relationship buckets here. So you're going to have multiple customers, you're going to have multiple peers, you're going to have multiple direct reports. You'll usually only have one manager, although you may have more depending on how the hierarchy is structured. You can include even a skip level boss here too. So the boss's boss. So there's some creative license you can have with these groups here. So each individual involved in those relationship buckets is asked to complete the 360 online survey based on his or her working experience with the subject. And there's really typically 2 types of questions that raters are asked to answer. It's these scaled questions that we've talked about already. And the second type of question is what we call an open-ended question. And this is where raters are presented with a specific question, and then rather than selecting from a scale, they're asked to answer by typing in comments. And it's basically a free-form response option that a rater can type in anything that they want related to the question. So in addition to all of the raters individually answering the same survey, the subject is also asked to provide feedback on him or herself, and this is referred to as a self-assessment. And so the subject is also answering the same questions on the same survey that the raters are using. And this is really goes to the heart of what 360 is all about. It's really the idea that you want to have the subject answer the same set of questions as the raters, because what you're looking at is really sort of differences in perception, differences in how the subject views him or herself relative to all those raters. So once all parties involved, that's all of the raters and the subject, have had ample opportunity to complete a survey, the data or all of that information provided by each person is combined, or what we call aggregated. And the process of aggregating all of that data results in a series of numerical information, which may include means or averages, the standard deviation, sample size, or how many people answered a specific question, as well as other metrics. The most common metric you're going to find on any 360 is usually going to be the mean or the average. It's the most widely reported metric on a 360. So this is typically what a 360 report might look like. We look at the competency level, right? So the competency level is really that overarching level, the one that each individual question is associated with. So multiple questions are combined to create a competency. And in this case, this is a 360 report from the FASTMIR platform, where things like changing and adapting, leading others, influence, and you can see at a very high level how each of the groups that we talked about earlier, the self, the boss or the manager, clients or customers, direct reports, peers, even a skip level boss, how each of those groups rated this specific subject. So you can get some indicators about how each of these different groups views this person's ability in the area of influence or leading others or keeping people motivated. Okay, so the other area, in addition to the competency breakout that you're typically going to see on a 360, is what we call the question breakout or item breakout. We use question and item interchangeably. Items refer to questions on a survey. We can see that there's 2 questions that compose this overall concept or dimension of influence or competency, called influence. Influencing others toward a desired course of action, and is a shrewd negotiator. And the important component about questions or items is that they need to focus on behavior and they need to be observable. And the reason that that is important is because this is really where you start to identify strengths and weaknesses of the subject. When you have behaviorally written items or observable items, you can then begin to provide ways for somebody to improve in an area that they may not be strong in, or on the contrary, if they are strong in it, you can provide them with ways to continue to move forward and leverage that and use that skill more often. Another important point about 360 is that it's most often conducted in what we call a confidential or anonymous way. This means the individual who's the target of feedback doesn't know specifically which coworkers provided what data. an example here would be for direct reports. We have 4 people that provided data, but it's all aggregated into one overall average. The subject doesn't have any way of determining who provided the 3 or who provided the 2. The idea here is that you're protecting the anonymity of some of these raters, because what you don't want to happen, especially in positions of power, say for direct reports, is you don't want a boss to retaliate against direct reports. You generally will, like you said, aggregate this data so you're providing anonymity for a lot of these raters. Now, typically the boss is not anonymous, but the power dynamic between a boss and a subordinate is a little bit different. So that's generally considered okay. The other reason you do this is when raters feel that they can be honest, they're going to provide the most valuable feedback, even if it is what we would consider constructive criticism. And so the reason we do break all of these out is because we really want to understand how each of these different groups views this subject. It's really an important distinction, especially if you're getting into something like direct reports versus the boss. So direct reports see the influence skill much lower than the boss does. Those are important points because we want to understand if the subject is actually acting differently or treating people differently based on how they're categorized. So a lot of times one of the things that we'll see is what's called managing up, kicking down. So the boss will give the subject a high rating and the direct reports will give a substantially lower rating. This is generally because the person maybe manages up to their boss very well, but they tend to mismanage when it comes to their own direct reports. So this is why we break these out. We want to see all of those different sort of perceptions among all of those key groups. So here's some of the typical use cases for 360. And one key component is that 360 needs to be goal driven. You need to understand, you need to have an end game for what you're using 360 for. Is it for performance management? Are you just looking at professional development? Are you looking at leadership development, high potential identification? Are you looking at using it for selection into a training program? So one of the things that I'll talk about in later videos is this idea of using 360 for performance management, because this is a particularly controversial topic in 360 right now. You have really 2 groups. You have groups that think 360 should only be used for development, and then you have other groups that say, you know what, look, you could use it for performance management too. I won't get into it here. I'll do a separate video on that, but suffice it to say 360 can be used for performance management. You do need to be aware of some of the pitfalls of doing that if you are going to use 360 for those reasons. Some of the other reasons, you've got professional development, which is really one of the most common ways 360 is used to take all of that information you saw earlier in the report and really provide a plan of action around closing gaps of weakness. Other ways that 360 is used, leadership development. This is another really common way, especially at the sort of middle manager and executive level. This 360 is very effective because as you rise up the chain of command, leadership is less about how technically competent you are, and it's more about how well you execute through other people, how well you influence, motivate, and really can get the job done through other people. High potential identification is another area that 360 is used for. And so this could be sort of some early career identification where maybe you're trying to pick out an individual contributor or maybe a first line manager and try to identify whether or not they have potential to sort of move up the ranks from the organization. You'll typically use 360 in conjunction with some other tools to determine that. And selection into a training program is another area you might use 360 for. So where in the organization can 360 be used? You can really use 360 at all levels of hierarchy within an organization. As long as it's goal-driven, you've designed the actual survey well, you've written the items well, or you've purchased a reputable 360 from a third-party vendor, you can really utilize 360 at all levels of the hierarchy within an organization. So that's individual contributor roles. So there's typically going to be people who don't have direct reports, middle management roles, executive roles. So it's a very flexible tool in that respect. So what are the benefits of 360? First is that it provides a way to measure things that are hard to quantify, and it allows you to do this in a really systematic way. And because you're using a survey and eliminating the face-to-face interaction, you're increasing the likelihood that raters will be candid in their responses. Another important point is that the 360 method provides feedback that a subject might not otherwise receive. I hope you got some value out of this video on understanding what 360 feedback is. If you have questions, you can feel free to write them in the comments. You can also go to our website here at fastmeter.com. And if you're getting ready to launch a 360 program and you want a dedicated platform that can help you do that, you can schedule a strategy session with us. We'll do a real quick half-hour to 45-minute demo, and you can see our platform and see how it works. Thank you for your time, and if you haven't already, click on the subscribe button there so that you'll be notified of any new videos that we put up regarding 360. I'll talk to you later.